of the most discussed aspects of the Nancy Guthrie case is the person captured on the porch. Another is the reported ransom communications that followed her disappearance. But recently, attention has returned to something that happened before any of that. Before the porch footage, before the investigation, before the national headlines, a reported conversation involving money. According to publicly discussed information surrounding the case, Annie Guthrie reportedly asked Nancy for a loan not long before Nancy disappeared. The request itself is not evidence of a crime. Families borrow money from one another every day. Parents help children. Children help parents. Financial discussions happen in households across the country without incident. By itself, a loan request means very little. Investigators rarely examine events in isolation. They examine sequences. They look at what happened before, what happened after, and whether seemingly unrelated events begin to form a pattern when viewed together. That is why the reported loan request continues to attract attention. Not because it proves anything, but because of where it appears in the timeline. To understand why people keep returning to this issue, it helps to look at the sequence of events. According to publicly available information, Nancy Guthrie was living independently in Tucson, Arizona. She was 84 years old. Despite health challenges, she maintained an active life and remained closely connected with family members. Then reports emerged that a request for financial assistance had allegedly been made shortly before her disappearance. The details surrounding that request have been discussed extensively online and in media coverage, though many specifics remain disputed. What is not disputed is what happened next. Nancy attended a family dinner on January 31st. Later that evening, she was reportedly driven home. The following day, she was gone. That timeline alone is enough to make people pay attention. Now consider how investigators typically approach financial issues in missing person cases. The first questions they ask is whether there were recent disputes involving money, property, inheritances, debts, or financial pressure. The reason is simple. Financial stress often creates motives. That does not mean everyone facing financial difficulties commits crimes. Most do not. Investigators still examine financial relationships because they can provide context. In this case, the reported loan request has become part of that context. The reason is not the request itself. It is the reported refusal. If reports are accurate, Nancy declined to provide the money being requested. Again, that decision is not unusual. Parents refuse financial requests all the time. Adult children disagree with parents all the time. Families move on. Life continues. Something doesn't fit comfortably when viewed alongside the timeline. A reported request, reported refusal, a final family dinner, a ride home, then a disappearance. Individually, each event can be explained. Together, they naturally invite questions. Detail matters because investigators often look for changes in relationships before major incidents occur. They examine arguments, disagreements, legal disputes, financial conflicts, and communication patterns. They ask whether anything changed during the days leading up to an event. Sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes the answer becomes one of the most important discoveries in the entire case. Now consider another detail that has fueled discussion. According to public reporting, Nancy's home represented a significant asset. Discussions about finances, property, and future planning are common in situations involving aging family members. They are often routine. They are often completely innocent. Yet, whenever a person disappears under suspicious circumstances, those same financial conversations receive a second look. Investigators know something the public often forgets. Motives rarely announce themselves. They usually hide inside ordinary events, a conversation, a disagreement, a decision. Something that appears unremarkable at the time but later gains significance when viewed through the lens of what followed, is why timelines matter so much. The closer an event occurs to a disappearance, the more carefully it tends to be examined. Few reported events in this case occurred closer to Nancy's disappearance than the alleged financial disagreement. Now consider the final dinner. According to publicly available information, Nancy spent part of January 31st with family members. By all outward appearances, it was an ordinary evening. Families gather for dinner every day. There was nothing publicly reported at the time that suggested anything unusual had occurred, but investigators often revisit ordinary moments after extraordinary events. Who was present? What was discussed? What was everyone's mood? Did anyone notice tension? Did anyone notice concern? Did anyone notice something that seemed insignificant at the time? Those are the kinds of questions detectives ask because witnesses frequently remember additional details weeks or months later. The challenge is determining which details matter. Then there is the issue of timing. The reported loan request has become a topic of discussion, largely because of its proximity to Nancy's disappearance. Had the request occurred years earlier, few people would care. Had Nancy remained safe and healthy afterward, it likely would never have become part of the conversation. Instead, it occupies a place directly before the central event in the case. Does not make it evidence. But it does make it relevant, and relevance is enough to attract investigative attention. Now consider the way people interpret information. Human beings naturally look for connections. When two events occur close together, instinctively wonder whether they are related. Sometimes they are, sometimes they are not. The danger is assuming the answer before the evidence exists. That is why investigators focus on facts rather than assumptions. Did the request happen? What exactly was requested? What was said? Who knew about it? Were there follow-up conversations? Are there records that confirm the discussions? Those questions matter far more than speculation. Because answers create evidence. Speculation creates theories. And there is a difference. As this investigation continues, the reported loan request remains one piece of a much larger puzzle. It sits alongside the porch footage, the reported ransom communications, timeline, the vehicle examinations, and the many unanswered questions that still surround Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. By itself, proves nothing. But when investigators build timelines, they do not ignore events simply because innocent explanations exist. They document them. They verify them. They place them in sequence and determine whether they help explain what happened next. The question is whether this reported financial disagreement is simply another ordinary family matter that became part of an extraordinary case, or whether it represents a detail whose significance has not yet been fully understood. The reported loan request becomes more interesting when placed alongside another part of the timeline that investigators have never publicly explained in detail. According to publicly available information, Nancy spent the evening of January 31st with family members before being driven home. That dinner has become one of the most discussed events in the case because it represents the last known period during which Nancy was confirmed to be with people who knew her well. At first glance, there is nothing unusual about that. Families gather, they share meals, they spend time together. But after a disappearance, ordinary events often receive extraordinary scrutiny. Investigators know that the final hours before a person vanishes can reveal information that seemed insignificant at the time. That is why they frequently revisit conversations, schedules, phone records, and witness accounts. They are not looking for dramatic revelations. They are looking for small details that help explain larger events. In Nancy's case, the final dinner sits at the center of that process. According to reports, Nancy was driven home later that evening. What happened after that remains one of the biggest mysteries in the entire investigation. The reason is simple. The timeline begins to narrow. The number of people with direct knowledge becomes smaller. The opportunities for independent verification become fewer. That detail matters because investigators often place significant weight on the last, confirmed interactions a missing person has before disappearing. Now consider another aspect of the case that continues to generate discussion. According to public reporting, Nancy's home became the focus of an extensive investigation almost immediately after she was reported missing. Detectives examined the property. Search warrants were executed. Evidence was collected. Digital records were reviewed. Vehicles associated with the investigation reportedly underwent forensic examination. Those actions tell us something important. Enforcement did not appear to view this as a routine missing person case. They treated the disappearance as a potentially serious criminal matter from an early stage. That does not identify a suspect, does not establish a motive, but it does indicate that investigators believed the circumstances surrounding Nancy's disappearance warranted a significant response. Now, place that beside the reported financial disagreement. Again, neither fact proves the other. A reported loan request does not become evidence simply because an investigation followed. Investigators are trained to examine whether separate pieces of information intersect. They ask whether events that appear unrelated may actually help explain one another. This is where evidence stacking becomes important. Loan request by itself may mean nothing. A refusal by itself may mean nothing. A family dinner by itself may mean nothing. Disappearance by itself creates questions. The challenge for investigators is determining whether those events are connected or whether they simply happened close together in time. Then there is the issue of communication. Question that repeatedly surfaces in discussions of the case is whether anyone noticed changes in Nancy's behavior before she disappeared. Did she express concerns? Did she mention disagreements? Did she discuss financial matters with anyone else? Did she indicate that she felt pressure regarding money or property? Publicly available information does not provide definitive answers to those questions, but investigators almost certainly explored them. They would have examined messages, emails, financial records, and witness interviews. They would have attempted to reconstruct not only what happened physically, also what was happening in Nancy's life during the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Process often reveals information that never becomes public. And that is one reason major investigations can take months or even years to reach conclusions. Now consider the role of motive. People often assume motive is the starting point of an investigation. In reality, investigators frequently discover motive after they understand the facts. They establish timelines. They identify relationships. They verify events. Then they ask why. In the Nancy Guthrie case, the reported financial disagreement attracts attention because money has historically played a role in many criminal investigations. Not always, not even most of the time, but often enough that detectives routinely examine financial relationships whenever a major crime occurs. The question is not whether money automatically creates suspicion. The question is whether money helps explain actions that otherwise make little sense. And that answer remains unknown. But something else stands out. As the investigation has progressed, public attention has repeatedly returned to events that occurred before Nancy disappeared rather than events that occurred afterward. That pattern is unusual. In many cases, the focus remains on the crime itself. Here, people continue looking backward. The reported loan request, the family relationships, the final dinner, the last ride home. The conversations that may have occurred before January 31st. Observers keep returning to those details because they believe the explanation may lie there rather than in what happened after Nancy vanished. Whether that belief is correct remains to be seen. Investigators may ultimately determine that the reported financial disagreement was completely unrelated to the disappearance. That remains entirely possible. Innocent explanations exist for every individual event currently known to the public. The challenge is determining whether those explanations still hold when viewed together, because investigations are not solved by examining isolated moments. They are solved by understanding sequences. As investigators continue examining the events leading up to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, one question remains difficult to ignore. If the reported loan request truly occurred shortly before Nancy vanished, role, if any, did that conversation play in the larger story investigators are still trying to piece together? As investigators examine the events leading up to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, one reality becomes increasingly clear. The reported loan request remains important not because it proves anything, but because it sits so close to the center of the timeline. In almost every major investigation, detectives look for moments where circumstances changed, a disagreement, a financial issue, a legal dispute, personal conflict. Most of the time, those events lead nowhere. Occasionally, they become critical pieces of a much larger picture. That is why the discussion surrounding Nancy's reported refusal continues to attract attention. When investigators build timelines, they are not simply recording events. They are measuring relationships between events. They want to know what happened, when it happened, who knew about it, and whether one event influenced another. The closer something occurs to a disappearance, the more likely it is to be examined. Consider the broader context. Nancy Guthrie was not a random victim selected from a crowd. Whoever may have been involved in her disappearance would likely have possessed some level of knowledge about her life, her routine, her circumstances. Investigators have spent months trying to determine how much knowledge existed and where it may have originated. Question continues to appear throughout the case. The porch footage raises questions about familiarity. The reported ransom communications raise questions about information. The timeline raises questions about opportunity, and the reported loan request raises questions about motive. None of those elements automatically connect, but neither can they be ignored. What makes this case particularly difficult is that every major detail appears capable of supporting more than one interpretation. Porch footage can be viewed as evidence of planning or evidence of uncertainty. The reported communications can be viewed as genuine ransom attempts or something else entirely. The financial discussions can be viewed as routine family matters or events deserving closer scrutiny. That ambiguity is one reason the investigation has remained so challenging. Public discussions often focus on finding a single piece of evidence that explains everything. Real investigations rarely work that way. More often, detectives gradually assemble dozens of small details until a larger picture emerges. Individual pieces may seem insignificant. Together, tell a story. The question is what story investigators believe the evidence is telling. Now, consider another factor. Time has a way of aging investigations. In the early days of a case, people focus on immediate leads. They focus on searches, witness statements, and urgent efforts to locate the missing person. Months later, investigators often revisit events that initially seemed routine, re-examine interviews. They compare statements. They look for inconsistencies. They test assumptions that were accepted during the first stages of the investigation. Process frequently reveals information that was overlooked. A conversation gains new meaning. A timeline becomes clearer. Financial transaction becomes more relevant. A witness remembers something important. Cases have been solved because investigators refused to stop asking questions about events that others considered unimportant. That is why the reported loan request continues to surface in discussions of Nancy's disappearance. Not because it is proof, because it establishes guilt. But because investigators are trained to follow every significant lead until they can confidently determine whether it matters. And right now, members of the public continue debating whether this particular detail matters. Some believe it is merely an unfortunate coincidence. Families discuss money all the time. Financial disagreements occur every day without leading to criminal activity. From that perspective, the reported refusal may have no connection whatsoever to what happened afterward. Others argue that the timing alone makes it impossible to ignore. They point out that investigators routinely examine financial motives in serious criminal investigations. They note that the reported conversation occurred shortly before Nancy vanished. From their perspective, the issue deserves continued attention. Viewpoints exist because the public lacks access to the evidence investigators possess. That distinction is important. Detectives are working with information that has never been released. They have conducted interviews, reviewed records, analyzed digital evidence, and examined physical evidence collected during the investigation. The public sees only a fraction of that process. As a result, many of the strongest conclusions simply cannot be reached from public information alone. And that brings us back to the central question. The reported loan request occurred. What significance does it ultimately hold within the larger investigation? Was it a routine family disagreement that happened to occur shortly before Nancy disappeared? Did a detail investigators examined and ultimately ruled out? Or was it part of a sequence of events that has not yet been fully understood? At this stage, only investigators are in a position to answer those questions. What the public does know is that Nancy Guthrie remains missing. The investigation remains active. The questions surrounding the porch footage, the timeline, the reported communications, and the events leading up to her disappearance have not gone away. And until those questions are answered, details like the reported loan request will continue to receive attention because they sit at a crucial point in the story. Whether that attention ultimately proves justified remains to be seen. For now, the facts remain incomplete, the investigation continues, and the search for answers goes on. If you've been following the Nancy Guthrie case, let me know in the comments which detail you believe deserves the closest examination. Here at the Evidence Room, we follow the facts, examine the timeline, and track every development as investigators continue searching for answers. If you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss future updates on this case and others like it.